After nearly 4 months in a Connecticut prison, former Donald Trump advisor Steve Bannon walked out a free man today. With just 1 week until the election, Bannon's release comes as his former boss, Donald Trump, is locked in what polls show is the tightest presidential race in recent history with Vice President Kamala Harris. Bannon's been an outspoken critic of the Department of Justice response to the January 6th insurrection at the Capitol and was convicted for refusing to comply with a congressional subpoena related to the Capitol attack. Joining me now is NewsNation correspondent Rich McHughas, who is in Manhattan with the latest on Bannon's release and what we can expect to see from the former Trump advisor. Rich, Bannon is back at the helm of his War Room podcast, where he's using his prison term as a rallying cry for his supporters. Let's take a listen.
If you're not prepared to be sent to a federal prison as a political prisoner, then you're not worthy to be in this movement and to step forward and try to save your country. You have to understand, they want to put you in prison, and they will put you in prison.
Has called himself a political prisoner and said that he was happy to go to jail. Now he's telling his listeners they should be prepared to go to prison as part of the MAGA movement. Rich, this seems like this version of Steve Bannon may be even more radical than before.
Yeah, that's right, Drew. I mean, he's been out of prison at that point 7 hours. He appeared on War Room and said he was more energized, clearly is more energized. He blamed Nancy Pelosi for putting him in there, making him a political prisoner, saying she was trying to break him. The Democratic Party was trying to break him, and he said, none of it worked. I'm more energized than ever. And he had this tone that he was out for revenge of sorts, you know, and he's clearly a focused individual. What that means, we're probably going to find out here in just a bit at his press conference in more detail. Drew.
Now, the War Room podcast was once near the top of Apple's political podcast charts. Now that Bannon is back at the helm, what type of impact could he have on the MAGA movement now just 1 week before this election?
Well, just this morning, I believe, while he was live, there were 100,000 listeners and viewers listening to this. So it shows you the actual reach this podcast has. It sagged while he was in prison. He had co-hosts fill in, and so he couldn't be actively involved. He couldn't even get email while in prison. He was getting letters, apparently, and Kamala speeches sent to him via email. But the podcast continued, and now it clearly has resumed now that he's out of prison. And it looks to be his main messaging vehicle once again, Drew.
Has there been any indication that Bannon will join former President Trump out on the campaign trail?
That's a good question. He said this morning, I believe I heard him say in the podcast, and I think he also told the New York Times that he plans to show his support for Donald Trump on the trail. But Donald Trump gave a press conference this morning. He did not mention Bannon once, and there was no formal mention that he's going to be showing up in, say, battleground states in the next week. But you got to believe this is Trump's longtime ally, confidant and supporter, and he's a strategist for Trump like no other. So you got to imagine that at some point we're going to see him in one of these battleground states alongside Donald Trump.
Now, before reporting to prison in July, Bannon insisted he would work from behind bars to influence the presidential race. Was he actually able to keep that promise?
Well, his promise, I mean, kind of, I guess. His podcast continued, and so his listeners were subjected to co-hosts that gave his views, let's put it that way. But beyond that, he could not get the internet, so he couldn't be actively participating in these in the traditional sense. But having a podcast continue as one of the top podcasts, he was doing that. So I guess he did fulfill his promise in keeping his podcast alive, so it was here for when he returned as well.
Yeah, and this actually isn't the end of Bannon's legal woes. He is set to stand trial in New York this December. Tell us what that case is about.
So that is about misuse of campaign funds, misappropriating them. It was about the border. He was raising funds about building the wall on the southern border, and there's questions and charges that he misappropriated them, those campaign funds, directed them to himself. That is going to be in court in December in New York State. So it's very possible he could get found guilty again and be right back in the situation where he was. So that is, after the election, obviously, but it's conceivable that we could see him right back in the same spot.
All right, Rich McHughas in Manhattan, thanks so much for your insight. Appreciate you coming on.
Thanks, Drew.
Actor Jay Johnston, known for his roles in TV shows like Bob's Burgers and Arrested Development, was sentenced Monday for his connection to the January 6th Capitol attack. Johnston was sentenced to 1 year and a day after pleading guilty in July to one felony count of interfering with law enforcement during civil disorder. Prosecutors say he flew to Washington the day before the riot and marched to the Capitol after attending former President Trump's rally at the Ellipse. While at the Capitol, prosecutors say he used a stolen police riot shield to form a shield wall inside a tunnel and participated in a heave-ho push that pinned an officer against a doorframe. Johnston asked for leniency, saying he was fired from his recurring role on Bob's Burgers and has been blacklisted by Hollywood since the riot. Turning to the Middle East, where Tuesday morning Israel launched another strike in Gaza, this time hitting a 5-story building in the northern part of the region. That building was reportedly sheltering displaced residents. According to the Gaza Health Ministry, at least 60 people were killed in that strike, more than half of them women and children. That strike comes as new satellite imagery has raised questions about exactly how much damage was done by Israel's strike on Iran over the weekend. Images show Israel's attack likely damaged a base that builds ballistic missiles and launches rockets. That base is run by Iran's secretive paramilitary, the Revolutionary Guard. The images show damage that could potentially limit the ability to manufacture missiles, crippling Iran's arsenal. Iran has not acknowledged an Israeli attack on the region. And in Lebanon, Hezbollah leadership announced Tuesday that the militant group has chosen Naim Qassem to succeed its former leader, Hassan Nasrallah. The 71-year-old Qassem is a founding member of the militant group and has been serving as the acting leader since Nasrallah was killed in an Israeli airstrike last month. He has vowed to continue Hezbollah's fight with Israel, quote, until victory is achieved, end quote. Meantime, NATO officials have confirmed that North Korean troops are now operating in the Kursk region of Russia that borders Ukraine. Ukrainian troops established a foothold there earlier this year. Last week, Russian President Vladimir Putin refused to deny that North Korean troops had arrived in Russia, calling it Russia's sovereign decision where and when to use North Korean troops. North Korea had already sent ballistic missiles and ammunition to Russia after Putin and North Korean leader Kim Jong-un signed a partnership agreement earlier this year. NATO Secretary General Mark Rutte called the deployment a significant escalation and dangerous expansion of Russia's war in Ukraine. The Biden administration has finalized a new rule that blocks certain U.S. investments in Chinese technology sectors that could threaten U.S. national security. The rules were directed by an executive order signed by President Joe Biden in August 2023, which aimed to block U.S. investments in the Chinese sectors of artificial intelligence, semiconductors, and quantum information technologies. They are set to go into effect January 2nd, just days before President Biden leaves office. This is part of a U.S. push to prevent the Chinese government from developing sophisticated technology with national security implications. The Treasury Department's newly created Office of Global Transactions will oversee the new rules. A lot of focus is on the Electoral College, but which presidential candidate wins the popular vote can give some insight into which party may control Congress in the new year. NewsNation's Blake Berman breaks down the latest polling and what it means for down-ballot races.
So is there a race for the popular vote? I'm Blake Berman with NewsNation. Former President Donald Trump and Vice President Kamala Harris are vying to win the 270 Electoral College votes needed to win the presidency. That race likely to be won or lost in the 7 key swing states. But all across the country, 2 national polls show the candidates are basically tied in the race for the popular vote. Now, that could have implications for who wins the House of Representatives and the Senate. An analysis done by the Hill Decision Desk HQ Election Center shows that if Trump wins the popular vote, there's a 99% chance Republicans take control of the Senate, an 86% chance Republicans keep the House. But if Harris wins the popular vote by 1%, Democrats have a 50% chance of winning the House. And if she wins by 8%, Democrats have a 50-50 chance of winning the Senate. I'm Blake Berman, and this is the NewsNation Political Minute.
You can find more news and analysis from Blake and our colleagues 24/7 on NewsNation. To find NewsNation on your screen, go to joinnn.com. That's today's Daily Debrief. I'm Drew Petrimoulx. Be sure to like, share, and subscribe to the Hill's YouTube channel. And come back here soon for the intersection between politics and policy.